My name is Tom Watson. I am the chair of the Laboratory Testing and Industry Organisation. And this event has been organised by Cignpost, who are one of the leading members of our organisation. We're very grateful to them for the work they've put in today. But I am very grateful to you because if you're on this discussion, I know you're on this discussion because you are one of the people that has basically saved the British TV and film industry in the last 2 years. And I know how hard it's been for you because one of the things you do when you're a retired politician is weird and wacky books and TV programs. And the one that I did was rowing the length of Britain in a rowing boat mainly with Craig Charles and a whole host of other characters, which required a whole production crew to travel 350 miles in a 75-strong COVID bubble with regular testing so that we could pass all the stringent health and safety tests. You did that, and you should be very proud of yourselves for the work you've done, because we've seen more than 200 productions made in this country as a result of the adaptability and the flexibility of the sector and the support given by the laboratory sector in general. So we're grateful to you today. One of the mechanisms that helped us reach that point is the production restart scheme. It's enabled productions to restart early, got us through the pandemic, but it's coming to an end, and that is why we are here today. Because with no commercial insurers able to offer cover against COVID at the moment, there's obviously concern about how the industry can protect the actors and crew and mitigate any financial impact that COVID might have on a production. And it's particularly concerning with rising infection rates, which went up 20% this week compared to last week. So that's why we've got our panel today. I'm going to introduce them as they speak rather than all in one go. But we're grateful to all of them for giving their time today, because I know how busy everyone is. Our first speaker is Jon Ling, Director of Production at Sony. Jon, I can only imagine the last 2 years that you've had. You've played the role you're playing at Sony. You've been in many other sectors, including the BBC. And you spent 5 years as a senior health and safety role in the corporate world. Please tell us your experience of the last few years and what your plans are with Sony. We'll ask each speaker to speak for about 5 minutes. And don't worry, I'll be a generous chair if you've got more to say than that. And then we'll try and get you back in for the Q&A at the end. Jon Ling, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay? Just put your thumb up. Good stuff. Okay. So hi. So thanks, Tom. My name is Jon Ling, Director of Production Safety for Sony Pictures Entertainment for the EMEA regions. That's Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm based in London. Our head office is actually in Los Angeles. We obviously make feature films as part of Columbia, TriStar, and ScreenGen Pictures, and also high-end TV productions via our international TV production companies as well. And we're part of the global the global Sony Corporation based in Tokyo. So when I'll sort of talk about a few bits here. So firstly, the early days. And so when COVID first hit in March 2020, all our productions ground to a halt. No one knew how long it was going to go on for. Giving you an example about, Columbia Pictures, Uncharted, film you probably all, well, some of you may have seen in the cinema, I'm not sure, but that started filming in Berlin, March 16, 2020, and then stopped filming the same day. Didn't resume again until July. And then when it did, a key cast member tested positive for COVID. So straight away, you can see some of the problems that we faced as part of our productions. From July, some of the productions resumed as best they could. Some switched to other countries where there was less COVID cases and travel restrictions allowed. Some used sort of creative solutions, such as applying makeup in close-up, but applied it using digital post-production techniques, for example. But the things that we take for advantage now wasn't available, and what was available then was slow and expensive and in short supplies. So many of the companies, the sort of testing companies and the COVID supervisors that appeared had no experience of COVID, or the TV and film industry. So we're all learning on the job. For us, one of the biggest breakthroughs early doors was, particularly for the feature films, was the use of mobile labs on location. They were fantastic for reducing the length of the time it took to get the results. Plus, it meant that the COVID teams were part of the production. They were sort of ingrained in what was going on. In the US, as many as 80 to 90% of our productions, so our cast and crew, are members of various unions and guilds, such as the Directors Guild, SAG or IHATSE, and they introduced a return to work agreement, which meant that all our productions with at least one union member had to adhere to the agreement. So that was largely all our feature films and some high-end TV. And then from this, we developed our own easy to understand protocols for our own productions to follow. Now, typically these productions would follow the protocols, which are slightly more relaxed currently because of the current situation we're in at the moment. But it could be anything around rules around mask wearing for both indoors and outdoors, pre-employment testing. We would recommend daily health checks, like a questionnaire. There was a prescribed cadence or frequency of testing regime and what types. So typically a PCR plus antigens. And that was based on a zoning system. So for example, a red or an A for principal, cast and crew, and the current situation where we were, so which country we're in, for example. It also stipulates separation distances, ventilation routines, and cleaning, that sort of stuff that you would kind of expect. But we still had a huge number of cases, which causes problems. While some of our smaller TV production companies were able to use the production restart scheme, and there were 16 times that we actually dialed into that, which was great. On the film side, the feature film side, we had to self-insure and take the hit. So hence the necessity to have really robust protocols in place was essential. So how does that work in practice? So just a sort of brief run through about how it works for us on a film. So many of the countries we choose to film in offer us a tax rebate, offset against the cost of the film. The normal caveat is that we employ a percentage of local staff, and that may mean using a local COVID supplier. Therefore, understanding the current situation in those countries was key for us. So many countries don't always take health and safety as seriously, maybe as the UK might. So this causes a few problems as well. Once the key individuals are in place, and it's normally the producers is one of our main sort of key contacts, because overall they are generally responsible for health and safety on a film or high-end TV program. We have initial kickoff meeting to find out what it's about, the locations and who involved. We then have separate meetings with the appointed COVID supervisor to discuss the protocols and the plan. As I mentioned before, if it's union cast and crew, normally are larger films, we have to adopt the latest version of the return to work agreement. And there's been many different versions of that, if you like, have appeared. We've got another one at the moment that's in place, which finishes again in July and is due for renewal then. On a non-unionized production, we'll opt a sensible risk assessment-based approach, dependent on the country and the current situation. And I suppose what the productions want ultimately is for their testing to be minimal risk, quick turnaround, simple to use, and low-cost models. We also have weekly check-ins with the production, plus there is a weekly call with, so all our HSCs or COVID supervisors can join in to share knowledge. And there's normally a doctor or a medical professional in that call as well. The production is then required to report in weekly cases into our online reporting system, so we can monitor case numbers, and where the numbers have crept up, we will have a key group call with the key people involved to determine the next steps. And that may involve upping the testing regime, or it may involve taking a hiatus on the filming, which obviously we desperately try to avoid, but it has happened on a few occasions, and obviously that costs us a lot of money. We've also had the parachute drop in a COVID expert from time to time as well, and this happened recently early in the year in South Africa, where case numbers were extremely high. And the idea being is that person can then deal with any sort of particular issues that are going on at the time to try and resolve. What are we going to do in the future? So obviously, as Tom mentioned, case numbers are increasing across many countries in Europe. The concern is, of course, that we may head into another wave, possibly in the autumn, as productions move indoors, and particularly in Eastern Europe, where we do a lot of stuff, it may be colder there, for example. There does seem to be some assurance about, we've found out, albeit with premiums that are remaining very high, and there are lots of caveats in place, and I'm not sure how that will work as we move forth. We also consider making it a non-UK based production, so it means that we can take advantage of similar production restart schemes in other countries. Some commissioning execs I know are looking at sort of innovative ways to cover the costs, with again some caveats, but I'm not sure really at this stage how easy that will be to impart and how to do. We're always looking at new technologies, so point of care devices such as IMF, immunofluorescent testing, does seem to be the way forward. And I suppose to sort of finish up really, I suppose a film or TV set can be, in lots of respects, one of the safest places to be with all the protocols in place. But what we can't do is stop the crew and the cast going to pubs, restaurants, events, nightclubs, or home with their families at the end of the filming, whether that's the end of the day or the weekends. We can advise them to be sensible, but it's difficult to influence or actually enforce. I think the TV and film industry has shown great resilience and tenacity in returning to work and making these things happen, seeing massive growth in the UK, which is fantastic for the industry. We've just finished one large film here in the UK, which was shot here in the end because of COVID. We've got 4 more in prep across Europe, and a number of TV productions that are either in prep or in production across the UK and the globe currently. So cinema seems to be thriving again. We had a great success in 2021 with Spider-Man: No Way Home, which is the biggest grossing film. So from our perspective, it's been a good experience, but yeah, who knows what the future holds. So that's me, quick run through. I think now I'm handing over to Becky.
Yeah, John, I'm going to introduce Rebecca if that's okay. But thank you for that. Thank you for that contribution. I could see your workload has been huge in a way that it perhaps wasn't 2 years ago. So thank you for that. Rebecca Knapp. Rebecca, you are a 4 times BAFTA nominee.
I know.
And you've worked in film and television for over 20 years on programs as varied as drama, documentary, and entertainment over 3 continents. So you're very, very experienced. I know you've line produced and produced dozens of projects, large and small, from shorts to feature films and television drama. Can you tell us what you think the challenges are for the independent sector right now and in the future?
Yeah, so just building on what John was saying, obviously we don't have some access to someone like John unless we're lucky enough to get funded by his organisation. So I think in preparation for this talk, I chatted to a few producer friends, and I think there's quite a lot of head scratching going on about what's the best way forward, both in terms of, ensuring that they've got the right testing regimes in place, ensuring, that they've got the money in place as well. And I think, some of the sort of things that we've been talking about is how do we create a safe working environment? Like John was saying, film sets can be one of the safest places, but obviously COVID, has been, we know that mental health has suffered under COVID, and we know that also that hasn't been best practice sometimes in our industry, which is getting better. So how do we create somewhere that's going to be safe for our cast and crew, as well as focusing on more the business side? And so naturally, when we've got people on our shoot, we don't know what trauma they've had before, what personal loss they've got. So we need to be able to ensure that we've got that right environment and have a duty of care. As we're saying at the moment, and talking to my friends, there doesn't seem to be much options out as an alternative to the scheme that's out there, and so that, I think there will be a number of approaches that people will come up to depending on their requirements for their financiers, bond companies, and indeed, as John was touching on, demands from cast and crew, whether that be through their unions or also just general conversations, how are we going to put that in place? I think for shorter shoots, I think probably a more pragmatic approach is going to happen, where people are going to do testing, but they're going to be thinking about we're only at risk for a smaller amount of money and for a smaller period of time, because obviously it's maybe a one-hit wonder. I think for advertising, that will be very different, because it tends to be a huge amount of cost for one day's worth of, or a few days worth of filming. For longer shoots where there's more money at stake, I think, and then of course more perceived risk, I think we will be making use of all the procedures we've already been using, and it will depend on, as I said, there are demands of both the financiers and how the producers feel themselves as to what kind of testing or protocols they're going to take in place. Personally, I have a more cautious approach because I take that responsibility seriously. I think possibly having done law at university kind of indoctrinates that in your head, Tom, in terms of those. I think we'll also start employing some of the techniques that we were doing earlier on. Like I can foresee people deciding to start self-isolating with shoots again, perhaps, moving into that, certainly taking advantage of the bubbles, or, looking at how do we take innovative approaches, and we're nothing in our industry but innovative. Again, that comes with a huge cost. So there's going to be, I suspect, a film by film case basis. It won't be a uniformed approach, whereas perhaps we were kind of looking more that way. So as I was saying, I have been talking to some of my fellow producers, and I was talking to an independent producer who's filming this week. She literally started on Monday, so wasn't able to take advantage of the government scheme, where it was at least going to be only available for 4 days. And so one of the things she was getting asked to do by her finances was make sure she had at least 5 days cover. You know, if someone fell short of, came up with COVID on the shoot, then they would have to have at least 5 days out of their contingency. Because in their instance, they've got someone, my phraseology, Tom, is they had someone of a more senior vintage, shall we say, in the leading role, who was in every single scene. And so they wanted to make sure that they were protected. So they were very much going for PCR testing around that individual, whereas perhaps some of the rest of the crew, because of the costs involved and the low budget, they were very much more using lateral flows. They'd already had a COVID outbreak, which they then, at this instance, had just been forced to kind of work around, luckily not with their leading actor. So again, I think, you know, it's going to be a case-by-case basis. But for me personally, hearing that, I think it's worrying, this development of taking it out of contingency. You have contingency there for other reasons, because for however good your budgeting and scheduling skills are, the unexpected happens. And that, as we know, wasn't COVID is what we were thinking. I think, you know, which is why it was not in many insurance policies. I'm sure every insurance policy has it. And I can then see it go that rolling forward and it ending up being producers' fees is that extra buffer, which sometimes happens on independent films, and it's there to incentivize you to stay on budget. But how can you do that with something that's evolving like COVID? It's not like you've not been spendthrift, it's just you can mitigate so far with COVID, but there's only so many procedures you can put in place. So I think, you know, as a producer's perspective, we're going to be, like Jon, keeping our eye on new variants, looking at how the caseload's increasing. I suspect that building off from Jon, like him, we're going to be looking at places where we can film where we do have that added protection. So that may mean we start losing productions from the UK. It may be, you know, we're going to be looking at what we're shooting. You know, I suspect crowd scenes will be disappearing, or we'll be looking at alternative ways of doing those. So I think, you know, it's an evolving picture, and I think one that independent producers are going to find challenging without that additional protection.
Thanks, Becky. That's a worrying contribution. Our next speaker is Tim Thornhill. Tim, you're a director of Tysers. Many people on this call will know you, I'm sure. One of the UK's leading media, film and television insurance brokers. Can you tell us what is currently on offer and what's not on offer in the sector now that we're losing PRS, Tim, and your sort of analysis of that?
Sure. So yeah, what is on offer is very limited at the moment, and particularly specifically in the UK, it's limited. But there is some hope of what could be around. Now, just to give some context around why there is nothing on offer as it stands today, or a very, very limited scope for insurance. It's all about the losses that took place back in 2020, but specifically, I mean, on the 24th of January 2020, the restrictions were put in on most of these policies because of the fear of what would happen with COVID. But there were so many policies that were bought which had that, which were for productions that were shooting post January and into the sort of times when we were having lockdowns that caused those huge losses. And those insurers, we're a broker at Tysers, those insurers, some of them pulled out completely of insuring films and television because of the losses they made, and others have just said no, absolutely not. We're unable to write anything for communicable disease, and that is. That has stuck with most insurance markets, but there is some hope now, and I think that hope has come from some of the results that we've seen from the PRS scheme, because many of you will know how it was structured from July 2020, where there was a 1% rate charged on the limit, and that increased to 2.5% at the back end of last year, which was the aim for that was to allow producers, production companies to get used to a higher rate of 2.5% to pay for COVID insurance, so that the commercial market could step back in again. Unfortunately, the government was a bit premature in withdrawing the scheme. It should have lasted until, in our view, until at least 30th of September, when some of the other COVID schemes were running. But the point here is, at 2.5%, it looked like, and we haven't had all the data because there's still a few days left of the scheme, it looked like that was there or thereabouts in terms of breaking even or potentially making a profit. So that shows that there is scope for the future, and that has allowed a couple of insurance markets, we're speaking to a few at the moment, who are starting to take this a bit more seriously now that we've had 5 or so months living with COVID, as it's termed, and so we're actually now starting to provide some quotes. Now, what we've got to look at here is what we can provide, or what is available. It is more expensive than the PRS scheme was, and at the 2.5%, it has more limited cover. The cover is not as we saw previously, and that is specifically in relation to some things that don't really matter, because it's very unlikely that we're going to be going into a civil authority shutdown, but some things that sort of do matter, but that's going into quite a lot of detail, which if anyone would want to, they'd be able to sort of read the wordings that have been produced for this. So there is some hope, but it's limited, and it's quite slow, and the underwriting is challenging, and there will be things like increased deductibles, which are the sort of excesses, and there will be less capacity available. So as soon as say there is 5 million available, all of those productions would have had to have completed, or some of them would have had to have completed before more policies can be taken out, unlike the government scheme, which was not unlimited, but was hundreds of millions. So we're going into a phase now where we're working as hard as we can to make sure that cover is that insurance cover is available as soon as possible, and that it can be available and refined so that it is absolutely fit for purpose. And we're speaking to a number of producers, production companies, to try and make sure that we get to a point that where we have something that's good. In the meantime, as we go through this phase, as we've heard from Becky and John, there's going to be all sorts of things like contingency, increased contingency for COVID, all of the other mitigations that have been spoken about today, and anything that can be done in the specific sort of subsectors, because as we know, not having the PRS scheme is going to impact the smaller independents more than those than others, and so we need to sort of make sure that we're taking focus, as brokers, need to make sure we're sort of taking focus on the areas that certainly need it most, and focusing our efforts on those, but also with all the others in mind. So that's pretty much where we are at the moment, and we just hope for a speedy transition into the commercial market, and hope that it's going to be affordable, and that financiers, as we get into the next few months, are lenient enough to allow for the fact that COVID might not be fully covered, so that they can still provide funding for all sizes of productions.
Thanks, Tim. Fascinating contribution. I should just say that the lab testing sector did do their very best to lobby government on your behalf to extend the scheme, but we didn't win on that one, I'm afraid. But we tried our hardest. And before I bring Neil in, our final speaker, just to remind people, if you have got questions, please use the chat function to drop them in, and I'll open it up to the floor after Neil Sehmbhy, who is the Director of Corporate Sales at Cignpost Diagnostics. Those of you that know them, you'll know they did remarkable things very, very, very quickly during COVID. And Neil, you're going to talk to us about how testing, can play a role in mitigating risk, and then give all these independent producers we've got on some comfort that the future's bright and they're going to be okay, hopefully.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Yeah, 1.8 million tests. That's the number of tests that Cignpost has conducted for the TV and film industry over the past 2 years, which is an incredible number when you think about it, 1.8 million. And it's probably worth explaining how we got there. So if we went back in time to April 2020 and the pandemic had hit, the first lockdown meant that almost every business had to work from home. For the TV and the film industry, it meant the suspension of all filming. So what Cignpost were doing at the time was working with the PGA to create COVID-safe environments with mobile labs and fast PCR solutions. And if you remember back then, you had to send off to a lab to get a test, and it took a few days for the result. So having swabbers and a lab on site, Cignpost were able to reduce that time. So I think a few people have mentioned that the mobile lab's been really useful. And we were able to allow the pro golf tournaments to start up again. By chance, a few TV execs were at one of the first tournaments of Pro-Am, as you do. And we decided to work with them and created a solution that was similar for the TV and film industry. And the government had introduced the PRS scheme that Tom and Tim have mentioned. So what it meant was there was confidence within the whole sector. So if they started filming again, they could, with the knowledge that if there was a COVID interruption, the government would pick up the bill. But if we fast forward now, over 2 years, we've tested on over 200 productions within the TV and film industry across the USA, Europe, UK, and Canada. And we've evolved as the virus has evolved. So initially, it was 3 times cadence on PCR testing. But as new variants have come in, we've introduced new point of care testing solutions like AMF and lateral flow. But Cignpost has always tried to maintain one narrative, which is safe and cost-effective COVID programs. And the main aim is to allow the production industry, the film and media industry, to keep producing these fantastic productions. One thing that we probably need to consider, though, is that the government's now pulled all of the COVID resources away. And that's both the PRS scheme that's critical towards and has been critical towards the film and media industry, but then it's also pulled away all of its free testing for businesses and for the country as a whole. And it's important for everybody to note that and understand that just because the government has declared an end of the pandemic, that doesn't actually mean that it's over for businesses or the TV and film industry. I worry when our scientific team and advisors sometimes say that, repeatedly they've seen throughout the pandemic, the virus evolving and changing in a number of surprising and unexpected ways. I don't want to be a merchant of doom, but it's important because it's likely to do so again. Some changes, such as the fact that Omicron turned out to be more infectious a variant, but critically it also led to less hospitalization, was actually relatively good if you think about it. That was a positive, and it's probably a reflection of the success of the government to roll out vaccines and boosters. But other changes in the future, such as new variants, high rates of infection in the winter, could be dangerous, especially for those that are unvaccinated or immunosuppressed or just in a vulnerable group. One stat that's interesting is right now, 1 in 35 people are infected with COVID. And a year ago, that figure was 1 in 16. So that just shows you when you relax restrictions, COVID can still infect large numbers of people. It's incredibly infectious. And I think John and Tim mentioned about the autumn surge that people are warning about at the moment. It could be a concerning new variant. And sadly, that's the nature of viruses. While nobody wants to return to lockdown or testing daily, our strong advice is to remain watchful and cautious, as Becky said. And that's why we're still working with a lot of TV and film producers and the COVID safety teams to devise, continuing regimes of testing so we can keep them safe without massive costs. But we're also adding other testing such as flu and cold testing, skin cancer and heart screening. So we could test those at the same time to look at a whole different plethora of testing. But with PRS ending, it's for productions to carry that financial risk alone of interruptions, and those on this call need to calculate or weigh up that what's a potential downside of an interruption due to COVID, or what's the minimum cost to mitigate the risk of an outbreak, and assess it individually. And we know what our role is. We believe that Cignpost can create safe working environments at the lowest cost, and it can minimize that impact on filming. So actually, for anyone that's on the call today, actually right now, what I'd like to offer is an audit of the measures that they have in place now or on future productions. And it might just involve key people or people that are vulnerable, but one of our specialists in our team would happily conduct an audit for free, just so you can understand what the risk and the implications are, and then you can put a plan in place to mitigate it.
Thanks, Neil. That's a very, very kind offer. I could see people smiling when you said that. So I think you might get some emails. Okay, everyone. I've in the Q&A. I've not had any chat Q&As. Is there anyone who would like to ask questions before I come back to the panelists? No, Claudia. Have you? I've got Claudia. Can I? Are there things? Can I? Am I seeing the chat properly here, Claudia? Yes, I have got one. Are there newer? This might be for you, Neil. Are there newer tests available that can reduce costs or provide faster results?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people have put a lot of thought and energy into, because at one point the options were PCR or antigen testing. So Cignpost, alongside a lot of other companies, especially members of the RTIO, have been researching a lot of different point of care testing. So it can be super fast PCR point of care testing, or it can be, as John mentioned earlier, immunofluorescent. There seems to be a trend now within the industry that immunofluorescence will take more precedence over PCR, because it allows you a really fast, relatively inexpensive test for red zone delegates, or even for crowd testing. But some of the challenges around these are the throughput. Invariably people on a production want a super fast test, cheap, that they can do in volume in a short window of time.
Okay, thanks, Neil. There's more coming in as we speak. I knew I'd just a bit of an avalanche coming now. Another one, is there still a reluctance? This might be for you, Rebecca. Is there still a reluctance or apprehension for crew and freelancers to come back to the set to work, because they're fearful of catching COVID?
I mean, I think there definitely will be amongst some people, because as I was sort of saying before, we just don't know what experience people have had, and nor do we want to inquire. And we also don't know their vaccination status, and you can't legally inquire on that either, or their vulnerability. So I definitely think there's certain people who are less keen to do that, and certainly the job adverts I've seen out there, there's much more geared towards work from home and much more an openness, certainly in terms of certain roles that you could effectively do that, not just that blended working of being a mixture of both. But I think it's very busy out there, as we know. So people are trying to attract people however they can. And I think that was one of the things I forgot to mention, was I can see people if, where they have options, if they're not feeling like they're being looked after enough, they're going to choose to go to the production where there is better testing, because certainly that would be a consideration I would have if I was in their shoes. So I think, yeah, there is still that reluctance amongst some people.
That's interesting. And is that your view as well, John? Are you finding that with your guys?
Yeah, I mean, my own experiences are that most people do want to work. They enjoy working. A lot of people don't want to be at home. I think a lot of the people that work, obviously, in the film and TV industry are used to the kind of way that people work, being away from home for months on end and so on. I do agree with Rebecca as well. I think there is a number of people out there that will be struggling, from a mental health well-being perspective as well. And again, I agree with Rebecca's earlier points that I think it's maybe something that we're not doing enough, to be honest. And I know it's something that we want to address here in particular. So, yeah, I think also I found as well is that we've faced a bit of a battle on some of our production, particularly in the UK. Once the mask wearing, the government dropped that in March or April, whatever it was. We had a huge battle on our hands because we were trying to satisfy the return to work agreements, which is a US agreement. The people working outside, particularly as the weather got better, couldn't see why they were still being asked to wear masks. And we saw some battles on our productions with COVID marshals trying to get that in place. But on the flip side to that, some people like the reassurance that the testing and the protocols and the regimes provide as well. So I can see it from both sides.
Okay, and that's probably why in the last few months we've seen a move away from PCR to lateral flow on productions or point of care testing. What's the conversations going on now with infections unusually rising over the summer, with a sort of peak expected in the autumn? Is now the time to start thinking about PCR again, or is it a bit early to make a call on that? And that's probably one for Jon and Rebecca again, I think.
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, yeah, we're always monitoring the situation. We have, as I mentioned before, we have some sort of COVID experts that are literally monitoring the situation in all the various countries that we're working on a day-by-day basis to see what's going on and trying to look at forecasts to try and pick up. We will probably respond more reactively, I suppose, if anything, and make a decision whether we need to increase testing, whether we need to change, moving from lateral flow antigen tests to more PCR based. So it is really very reactive in terms of what we do to some what we can be proactive, we do, but it's so unpredictable at the moment. No one really understands or knows how things are going to shape up currently as it stands.
Okay, and what do you think and is that the same for the independent sector, Rebecca?
I would say, and I mean, as we know with COVID, because we only need to go on Twitter, the varying perspectives on it. There is as many different perspectives in the film industry. I had one person who's going, look, we're doing lateral flows, but at the moment it's no worse than a cold in terms of symptoms. There'll be others who are going to fall more into the PCR camp. And I think, if we're not a signatory to the agreements that Jon is, I think, you have to really be responding to your cast and crew as to what they're comfortable with, as much as how are you going to fund that? It can be however cost efficient Cignpost may make it, it's still a cost that you have to get signed off by your financiers. So I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion between what you're comfortable with, what your crew's comfortable with, what your cast is comfortable with your financiers. I can see that changing over time, but I would say as we move into the autumn, I suspect people are going to be going more back to PCR. When we probably have a wave, shall we say?
That's fascinating. A couple of finance ones now, so I'm putting you on call here, Tim. One from Steve here, he says, do you think actors and production crew are going to be more mindful of general health screening in the future as COVID testing has become normalised? And what would that mean from an insurance point of view? I guess is there a wider testing regime that could be done on productions to make them even safer than they are?
So I think the main way to answer that question is to say that yes, from an insurance perspective, these are things that have been and are actively being looked at in terms of protocols, procedures, and then going down to eventually what the triggers of the claims would be for the actual claim payment. So these are things that are being looked at, but I think my personal view is I think it's going to be quite challenging to have those monitored. I think there should be absolutely some absolutely some guidance that is adhered to and that might be mentioned in the policies, but any policies that are coming up. But to have sort of exclusions put in place based on protocols that aren't followed would be a difficult thing to manage. So I would hope that's not going to be something that's going to happen in terms of the actual the structure of the way things are going to be made going forward.
Okay, and you may have answered this question in your contribution, but I'll put it anyway in case it stimulates more thoughts. What level of stipulations are the finance providers asking for to continue funding productions in the UK without a fit-for-purpose insurance solution at present, now that we've lost the restart scheme?
So from my perspective, I know that the straight answer is it depends on the finance provider. It depends on where the money's coming from, and it also depends on the so if it's banks are a lot more strict than other finance providers. So and as I mentioned in my contribution, that impacts different sectors to a greater extent. So I think hopefully as we get more knowledge of the claims that have taken place on the PRS scheme and claims that come in the early stages of the commercial market coming in, and a general level of the sort of mitigations that are expected by finance providers, it should become clearer, and they should hopefully, fingers crossed, become more lenient with more knowledge. It's the lack of knowledge that's the problem, and if being a pessimist, you would say it's going to get worse throughout the autumn, then we might not expect finance providers to be more lenient until we've had a winter with living with COVID.
Okay, thanks, Tim. A couple of last ones now. They keep dropping in. This probably for the producers, I suspect, but please, panelists, jump in if you want. Neil, you might be interested in this. Rebecca, a bit earlier, you mentioned the word senior veteran, or I think that was the phrase you used. I feel like one of those, actually.
It was senior vintage, but I'm sure in politics it's senior veteran.
I'm more of a gnarled up old veteran than a senior vintage. But are production companies looking, when you've got productions like that, where you have got, you know, vulnerable people, perhaps people who are immunosuppressed, are you looking at extra protections on productions like that? I
mean, obviously, as we know, and under you can get producers insurance where you'd insure them against certain kind of risks. So I do wonder whether it's going to fall into those sort of categories, or it might be like children under 9, you can't insure them for certain things. It may be those health checks, but again, it's going to be whether people are going to be willing to do that. You know, is it going to be additional health cover? Possibly. But again, it tends to be your leads, the director and the cinematographer, that they worry about in the most part. Not sadly producers, Tom. You know, I suspect it may get to the point where this is a bit like a completion bond, where some financiers will request it, some won't. You're going to have a whole, my perspective of the bond is they're doing a health check on your production in terms of your procedures. And I suspect, you know, as we go forward, as we get more knowledge, as everyone has been saying, then there's going to be procedures as in terms of whether it's Cignpost coming in and acting for those insurers and health checking your procedures to make sure you've got rigorous safeguards in place, whether that's on behalf of the producer and the insurer. I would hope that as we get more knowledge and people feel more comfortable about the percentage it's going to cost, it's going to become more an everyday, shall we say, if that's a better expression. Much like when we had the first bonds coming in, and certainly when we've had new tax incentives coming forward, you know, you'd find it was hard to get banks or those more commercial lenders into that space until they felt like this was a scheme that was up and running. So I suspect it's just a question of time and experience.
Okay. And final question from John, which is looking at this from the other end of the telescope. With the removal of government protections and lost salaries on productions and reducing payments to SSP, are we starting to see crew at times reluctant to test for fear of being isolated away from a production and not earning? That's probably one for John and Rebecca, and maybe you, Neil. But jump in if you've got evidence.
I mean, I'll kick off first if you want. I mean, I suppose this goes back to my earlier point about a general sort of fatigue around COVID. And I think, you know, this is not unique, I don't think, to the film and TV industry. I think, you know, a lot of people are fed up with it, and will be reluctant to test. You know, I think we'll have the same issues for people generally who are thinking about their summer holidays. You know, they want to get away. They'll be reluctant to test because there's no restrictions to fly for most countries. So it's an issue. I think, you know, if the senior people on a production set out their stall quite early doors in terms of, you know, stressing how important regular testing and all the other COVID protocols are in place, and then follow it up as well to ensure that it does happen. I think that's probably only the way you're going to do it. But yeah, I think to answer John's question, I think it is an issue. It's, yeah, and it will carry on being an issue, I think, you know. Yeah, I don't have anything else to really add on that. Maybe Rebecca can jump in and save me. I'm not sure.
I was just going to concur, actually. I think, you know, as we know from our own friends and family, some are very avid testers, you know, very following procedures, and others are more laissez-faire. And I think that would be the same with the crew. I think if you're going to institute it, you have to be leading from the front and setting examples, and as you say, setting your stall out, John, early doors to say this is the kind of production you're on, you know.
Okay, thank you. We're getting nearly to 2 o'clock, and I do want to end on time, so I've got time for 2 more quick questions. Caroline has asked, we're now working with those who have long COVID in front of the camera and behind the camera. It feels like we're entering undiscovered territory. What are your thoughts on coverage for this situation? That might be for you, Tim, if you've got asked for people covering it, or all the producers as well.
I'm going to struggle to answer that one, to be honest, because I don't know enough about the long COVID and whether it's contagious. But certainly, I think the main thing on the insurance, from the insurance perspective, is based on delays. And so if anything is going to cause a delay, and long COVID is it, yeah. Currently that would be, it seems like that would be excluded, because it might not be based on testing.
I think maybe sitting behind Caroline's question was the fact that people have good and bad days at work, and they might end up missing some scheduling. Have you picked up on that, Rebecca? I can see you nodding there. Yeah.
I haven't from the film industry, but, you know, from friends and family, you know, there's certainly there's a few people who are shockingly quite young who have long COVID, and I think that's going to be a challenge for any production. I think if it's a cast member, you'll be trying to schedule around it, but it may. I think it's going to be challenging to get any kind of cover on that. So it's going to be a question of how you then don't discriminate. And that kind of legislation, I think, would come into play. So it'd be a question of how do you enable people to do a job. Okay,
and I think, Neil, you want to comment on that, and then the final question is definitely for you, but I'll let you answer this one first.
Yeah, no problem at all. It was just a comment about the effects of COVID that we still don't understand. I feel like I'm the harbinger of doom on here, but the virus evolves so much, and the after effects of it, we don't fully understand. You know, I was reading something quite recently from a Dr. Cam Maximus, and he did a study of young, and it's to Rebecca's point, a study of, you know, young, fit males you'd expect. They're from the Swiss Armed Forces, and actually noted anyone who had kind of been exposed to COVID and caught the virus actually had a decline in their testosterone levels over a 6-month period following it. So what I wanted to highlight really quickly was that having risk mitigation is important, because we actually don't know the full effects.
That's worrying. This final question is definitely for you, Neil. As PCR testing is the obligation for PCR testing is reducing, and the numbers are reducing, Is there a chance that the COVID testing companies reduced to an extent that there may be difficulty for the sector to get testing when it requires it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, my team and I and Signpost as a whole have seen within this sector, and also within more of a direct to consumer market, that the providers have reduced quite dramatically over the past few months. So that the bank of having these trusted providers has reduced as they diversify into different things. I suppose the positive is that a lot of these organizations are Signpost, as I'm not just blowing the Signpost flag, but Signpost is a prime example of being able to scale up quite quickly in relation to what the challenges of the sector are, and COVID in particular. So I believe that the testing providers are reducing, but if there is a clear and imminent threat, that providers will be ready to react to the marketplace.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Look, we're wrapping up. I'd just like to thank our guests for their time today, our panel members, Neil, Rebecca, Tim and John. Thanks for your time. I know you're very busy. Thanks to the Signpost team for organising. And if you would like to get in touch, and you panelists won't see it, but you're getting some lovely thank yous in the Q&As now.
And thank you, Tom, as well, for chairing. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for jumping in, Neil. And can you just tell us, if they want the audit, which I would be biting your hand off, have they got the capacity to find you? We will be following up with that, will we?
Definitely. We'll definitely send out some contact details for everyone to access us.
Okay, well, okay. As the great Gordon Brown used to say, thank you for all that you do. Have a good afternoon. Keep making great film and television, and try and keep everyone safe. Take care.